So welcome, everyone. Welcome again. Let's get started. As Pam said, I am reporting back, let's say, that maybe that's the right term, from India. I recall, I think it was April when I had presented from India, where I had spoken about the heat, the humidity, the water crisis, and what is being done, or more likely what's not being done. So on that same vein, this is triggered from an incident on my return journey just a few days ago. So as it unfolded, this is what happened. 180 passengers were boarded onto a flight. This was a domestic flight, so it was a smallish plane. We were boarded and asked to sit, and the cabin door was closed. The inside temperature was between 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But there was a delay in getting the plane into the takeoff queue. The queue was very long. And apparently, the regulation is that you cannot switch on the engine, the plane's engine, into full mode until you're in the queue. Basically, you're about to take off. So unless the engine is fully on, the AC cannot be full on. So we sat in the plane in that temperature for 20 minutes, by which time the passengers were standing up and starting to revolt. And then 20 counting, we were told that it's just a few more minutes, and 30 minutes, by which time we had a full-on revolt on our hands. And I can tell you what that felt like. It's like sitting inside a tube of toothpaste, a metal tube of toothpaste. And my feet, I thought I was going to have a heat stroke. My feet were so hot. The response from the staff in the plane was to threaten to call the security, right? And I'm assuming that was protocol. So after a while, after the revolt really got unbearable, the door was open, the cabin door was open, air-conditioned buses were called, we were deplaned into the buses, where we waited until the plane was closer to takeoff time, and the doors were opened up, all doors, so that the cabin cooled down a bit. So what I see from this, this is not just a case of heat from climate. We know that that's happening. Everybody knows this. But what I'm talking about here, what came home to me, was how unprepared we are in terms of our management, our policies, our processes, our immediate response to when we really feel that edge, the climate edge. We don't have what it takes to respond. The response here was classic command and control. I will threaten to call security. Now that kind of command and control really only works if people are revolting against management as such. But that's not what this was. They were revolting against the conditions which even the staff were being subjected to. So everybody was in it together. So it's a different thing. It's a different approach we need to take to handle this. And we don't have what it takes. So it occurred to me, we are already too late in handling the effects of the climate. So we've been, or rather most of the talk has been around adaptation and paradigm shift, which, by the way, is what we are doing here in these sessions, is bringing a new paradigm into life. But maybe we need a third thing, an immediate operational response. And the basis of this third thing must be, I think, that we need to assume climate effects as a baseline assumption, no longer as a maybe it will hit me, maybe it's going to happen, or it's not going to be too big, and maybe it's not for us, or we'll wait till it hits us in a real crisis manner. So if we take this as a baseline assumption, then the operational response must shift from command and control to something else, because a mere command and control will create social unrest, will create person against person, organization against organization, people against companies, and so on. So what does that mean then, if we want to do an immediate operational response? What does it mean for us? And I realized how the market-based responses, which is such a basic thing about capitalism, but also how the whole world is moving towards a market-based structure, if not full-on capitalism. But market-based responses will not suffice. First of all, they're too slow, because the market looks for profit avenues to become apparent, to appear. Secondly, the diversity of solutions that are required will not appear in time, once again, because they're waiting to be triggered. And secondly, the market is typically not based on science. It's not based on looking to see what is the next spot or the next change in climate or some other metric that's out there. So we need something else. And what could that something else be? And I'm hoping that we can have that discussion today. So it's not that I have a solution, but I do have a tentative idea. Yeah. And this little quote from Nate Hagens, which Pam sent to me a few days ago, really, really highlights a similar type of thinking, where Nate has looked at society, the socioeconomic system, as a living system, but in his case, a complex system, but we should look at it as a living system, as having its own adaptivity, its own self-organization, its own autopoiesis. Given all of that, we cannot deal with the socioeconomic system in a mechanistic fashion, which, by the way, is what we have been doing as far as our response is concerned. But in living systems, we must be looking at and understanding that the emergence effects, the things that emerge as we do what we do, is how a living system works. This idea of incorporating emergent effects, emergent processes, emergent thinking into the market itself, into the economy itself, is something brand new, I think. And so this is my tentative proposal. The idea of new governance structures. Now, what would then be the role or the persona, if you will, of such governance structures? And it would be that this new governance, it doesn't have to be an entity, it doesn't have to be a person, it could be a set of processes, it could be a way of thinking, but just for ease of discussion, let's think of it as an organization. So a new governance organization whose role it is to look at the entire system all the time. And by doing so, watch or see the emergence of things as time passes and as things change within the system. Then have a predictive eye towards this emergence, not a responsive eye, because that is already too late, but a predictive eye. Then lead the market according to that predictive eye. And then the governance structure or the organization creates and supports the conditions for such leading edge market mechanisms. So in effect, we are incorporating the feedback loops, which are the natural part of complex systems. We are incorporating such feedback loops in a deliberate way into the system itself. Yeah. So I leave you with the question: what new and outside the box governance or non-governance, which is certainly put that on the table, structures might it be time for?
Thank you, Tanuja. I love the idea of does our civilization, can we tap into our civilization's autopoietic way and cultivate it so that it doesn't get stamped out every time by the instant gratification, mechanistic, quick fix mentality that drives our profit structure. Catherine, you're our expert on autopoiesis. Do you have a thought for that? Good morning. Oh, and you're on mute.
I think autopoiesis is so inherent that it's what is going to happen. Now, our challenge is to try and predict and maybe work with it. But it's going to happen whether we choose it or not. That's just what is. And being able to recognize it and to work with it, I think, is kind of the coming skill. And not being afraid of it. Trusting ourselves in our reactions, and instead of waiting to be told by somebody bigger, stronger, whatever, what to do, and trusting others that their responses are also as authentic as ours. That was kind of the learning curve that I see there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The idea of living in living systems, Catherine, I think is new. I know it seems so weird to be able to say that, but our mechanistic thinking is so deep. But the idea of living in constant change is brand new in science, in design, even in, I think, even in our personal lives, I think.
Colleen,
we've been educated to be predictable, to slow it down, to not spend the time or energy, to not do work, all those things.
Yeah, and to see stasis and to see repetition, repeatability as being some kind of stability.
Yep.
And lack of risk.
Yep.
And of course, that repeatability works until it no longer works. So then we have created a boom bust as a fundamental way of all of our processes.
Yep.
Gil, did you want to say something? Good morning.
Good morning. Tanuja, thank you for the provocation and for the thought that you've been putting into this. I'm kind of surprised by my reaction. This is feeling like a mechanistic prescription to get out of mechanistic game.
Okay.
I think the notion of prediction is folly in complex systems, certainly in the complex systems we're in now. And sensing, anticipation, and navigation, absolutely important. But the notion that we can predict outcomes of these systems, I think, is for me, is off the map. I'm surprised to hear you think that human governance systems can respond more quickly than markets. Markets are very fast, not necessarily a good thing. Speed is not always the benefit. We've got We've got shock absorbers in automobiles for a reason, to damp fluctuations and the possibility of knee-jerk reactions. Nikki pointed out that that political systems can be slow, viz. The tobacco lobbying against regulation, but that's that's a distortion in the political system. I don't know if any of you have spent time in government, spent time in startups.
You have.
In both, and the pace is really different, good and bad. Arguments for both ways, but I think so I guess I'm feeling that what you've laid out is a little simplistic and hopeful, and I said I was surprised because it's all the recognizable phrases and concepts that we've been developing for decades, and I'm with you on the intention, but I'm not sold on the application. And the last thing I'll say here for the moment is the richest attempt that I've seen to do what you're doing was the CyberSyn project in Chile 50 years ago under the Allende government, popularly elected socialist government that attempted to build a governance structure much like what you're talking about for the Chilean economy, led by Fernando Flores and Stafford Beer and others, and pioneered a kind of comprehensive view of the entire economy in real time, with a command center to be populated by a broad stakeholder of people from all levels and walks of life, not just technocrats, but not just like the folks who ran the copper mines, but also the head of the union that works the copper mines, and also the electronics companies that make things out of copper, and also the housewife who's buying a radio that has copper in it, all together looking at comprehensive view. Written about in a book called Platform for Change by Stafford Beer, and you can also Google CyberSyn. It was mocked up. It was never built because the computers necessary to build it were embargoed by the United States and Great Britain in advance of the coup that murdered Allende and toppled the government and brought in several decades of fascist rule in Chile, which tells you how dangerous these ideas are.
There you go.
But I would really encourage people, to dive into that, because that's groundwork, not as richly biological, Tanuja, as you're talking about, and that came later. Stafford's work with the viable systems model. So important precursors to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
So,
thank
you. Thanks, Gil. Our current way of thinking about government, or even of doing anything, is that either the market does it or the government does it. Now, government should not be doing, as in go out there and build a new chip or some such thing. And then it would be very, very, very slow. I agree. But market that is purely profit driven is waiting for signals. The very act of waiting for signals, basically waiting for profit avenues, that very act itself is the delay.
Yeah, I don't think markets are waiting for signals at all. Markets, if anything, respond too quickly to partial signals. And I would argue that the problem with markets is that we don't have free markets. We have distorted markets where the price signals are false. They don't represent, they don't reflect systems costs, and so markets act very quickly based on very partial information. We just shifted to EV, but when we had an ICE car, we would go to the gas station and pay whatever it is, $4, $4.50, $5 a gallon for gasoline, whose system cost is probably somewhere between $20 and $30 a gallon.
Right.
If people had to pay $20 a gallon for gas, internal combustion would be over in an instant. But it's distorted by subsidies. So what, $7 trillion per year of fossil fuel subsidies. So the market is operating within that price signal.
I agree. But I'm talking about a slightly different thing.
Okay.
And that is, for example, the solar panels, which are now catching on all over the world. It didn't come through a market push. It came through science and government and everybody suggesting that this is the way to go. And then subsidy. Subsidy came later, but that building of a intention, of know-how, of the understanding of need came first. And then the market said, well, let me see how we can make this profitable. Then the
No.
government said, oh, let me subsidize it.
No,
But if-
entrepreneurs created product that they took to market, and they either sold or didn't, and it was slow for a long time. And now we're at the
Right.
point where solar is cheaper than fossil in most of the planet. And because of, yes, intention, research, subsidy,
Right.
engineering, design, marketing, cultural uptake, and so forth. And we see an
Right.
exponential change curve
Right.
happening there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But now the side effects of that solar panel chip-based global movement are dramatically increased dependence on those chips, the solar chips, which are not as expensive as computer chips or AI chips, but still, they are still chips. That has not entered the market discussion yet.
Thank you,
So-
you guys. Oh, do you have one last thing, Tanuja, and then we'll hear from Jason.
Yes, please, Jason.
Yeah, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back to, this idea of sort of the prediction in an emergent system. And
Yes.
I'm kind of with Gil. I mean, I can't really get there because to me, if we become predictive in an emergent system, it feels like we are in this space that we've always been in where we think we know. We think we know what's going to happen. We think we know what, a reaction or a response to something is going to be. In an emergent system, I don't think we know. In fact, I don't think we know anything. We've got to stop this sense of I know, because we don't know anything. And so for me, it requires that we as humans and through any initiatives that we put forth, we have to be able to sort of shift back into this place of really being present, and really, adapt our ability or evolve our ability to truly listen. And not just listen to each other, but listen to the system. Listen, Joe Petroni, who some of you may know, has this wonderful thing of listen to the land, which I always love. It's that ability to truly be a part of and listen and be able to respond, in an appropriate way, based upon the information that is available to us right now. And we, then it doesn't mean that we get to, respond in this way and then, well, that's what we're going to do now, because every response is going to have some sort of that we have is going to have a response from the system. And we don't know what that's going to be. We don't know where that, unintended consequence may pop up. So for me, it comes back to how do we really develop in anything that we move forward with, this idea of being very present and being able to truly listen.
So I think prediction is the human condition. Because if I have a child, I want to be able to give the child a certain sort of life. Now I can predict. Prediction has been tied so far to control. And that's the piece that needs to be broken, in my opinion. But we are always looking forward. We're always needing to look forward. How can we look forward from being totally present? Perhaps that's the challenge. That's the spiritual and the consciousness-based state.
I think it's, for me, it's through, really intention, holding a vision and holding an intention, but not holding on to it so tight, that it has to look this way. It has to happen this way because we don't know.
That's right.
If we
And we
have
have no
a
control
vision
over
or
it.
intention, we have to stay really present with that. I mean, you mentioned kids and I'll now kind of go off into another direction real quick, and then I'll let others speak. But, I saw yesterday where this young man, who has millions of young men following him, had Donald Trump on his podcast and gave him a Cybertruck and a Rolex. And he's got all these, young, men in this country, like all riled up. They're angry and da-da-da. I don't know that any parent of those kids, really thought that their kid would grow up to be so angry. Right? But they weren't present with what was happening in the moment. Understanding like, hey, our son is really developing, some thought patterns or some behaviors or whatever. And how do we respond to that? You can't predict, how, and maybe we'll never really get this right, but you can't predict how anything is going to turn out. I guess is my point.
I agree with you, Jason. We can't, and yet we must. That's how we do things. Everything gets done. For example, I predict that because of this session today, I'll be late for lunch. And based on that prediction, I have made lunch early. Right? But I cannot predict that I will actually be late. However, that is our condition. I think the nuance is in saying that I put my little pebble of prediction into this big system of which I have no control. And then I'm present to what I have put in as well as what the system itself is doing. And then I don't get despondent if it doesn't work the way I want it to work, or I don't bring in all these, if I'm a leader of a country or something, bring in the army in order to ensure that my prediction is the one that happens. So that sort of thing, and yet we must always be looking forward. No, that's not right. We are always looking forward in order to run our lives day to day.
It's holding it loosely. I'm going to suggest that we hold all this
Yes.
the light
Yes.
touch. And we have so many hands backed up. This is super exciting.
Yeah,
One
can
more.
I just add, many, many spiritual leaders have called this to be able to dance with time.
Yeah,
That's
what we're talking about.
Exactly. That state of consciousness, awareness, and emotional, spiritual development is perhaps what we need to develop.
Yes, cultivate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cultivate, sorry, yes.
No, but that, exactly. John, welcome to Regen Poly. No. Regen.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, appreciate the conversation. I just want to share two, I guess if not three things from my education and experience. I want to first echo, I think, what Gail was saying, that I don't perceive newness in what's being proposed here. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying, like being 60-something years old and having seen what I've seen, I feel like some of what's being discussed here has been discussed before. So I just want to share three places where I think it's been discussed before and leave it at that. So the first one is this thing of adoption of new information, right? And I think it's a part of the human psyche, or especially the social human psyche, to reject new information, right? And so we have references like Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and then I think it's Thomas, whoever wrote Moore wrote Crossing the Chasm. And so there's stuff out there that has to do with, okay, so we get a sense of some new perception of something. And there's this whole bell curve of how the populace responds to that, right? There are these people that are all over it immediately because they were already looking for that new piece of information. And then you have this whole trail of how people follow other people through the, innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, Luddites, that whole curve. And I happen to believe from what I've seen in that curve. And so you have this challenge that even if there was somebody on a post, playing the lookout, you got to kill the messenger problem, that when that person reports back from their post, hey, there's this new piece of information we need to care about, 90% of the population that he talks to is going to reject what he says and initially, and no matter how well founded or how well documented, there's going to be that response to it, which is kind of like, I think, what Jason was saying about we think we already know. The second one I want to talk about real quick is where I've seen this in business. I think it's Blanchard back in the 90s that wrote a book called Mission Possible. And it was when Blanchard and I forget all those guys' names, but they were all the ones that were talking about the pace of things was really, really picking up. And with the e-world and the computer stuff that was coming, the internet, this is even a touch before the internet, but then the internet, everything was starting to move really fast in the private sector, to the point where it was scary, because it's kind of like you work on something for a month or 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, and you come out of your garage to find out the world's already moved on and doesn't need your thing that you started working on 9 months ago. And so they were talking about, well, how do we deal with this? And this was like when the stories of the Kodaks and the people that had R&D departments, but again, they weren't listening to their own recon, that with the information that was coming back. But the point of that Mission Possible book was really super consciously structuring the forward-looking part of the business from the status quo part of the business. And so I think that's a model of what part of what's being talked about here. There has to be somebody looking out ahead, working on the stuff that the status quo doesn't even know is coming yet. And I agree with Gil that I think the private sector is where this happens from my personal experience. Acknowledging that there is that's not a pure system, right? Because there is governmental encouragement, incentivization of some of that contaminates. So it becomes difficult to really sort out what Tanuja is talking about and what Jason and Gil are talking about. Like, where is the real seminal source? I don't know that you can find it because it's wrapped up in, well, I see it coming, so I'm going to fund the research. Well, now the research shows that it's coming, that whole wraparound. It's very, very difficult to separate who really saw what first. And that's where I kind of agree with Gil. It's the guys that are working on stuff no one even knows they're working on. They're not funded to work on it. They're working on it. Passion projects and entrepreneurship and stuff is where I personally think that origin is. And then the final one I'll just add is scenario planning. I think this subject of the difficulty of prediction and that the complete obviousness of the uncertainty of prediction, we've been struggling with that one for decades as well. And I think the best information that I've seen comes back to where through scenario planning, you don't try to predict the future, you try to predict an array of futures and then formulate a plan that works best no matter which one of those occurs. And I'll stop there, but thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you,
Thank you,
John.
John. Yeah, so for laying it out so clearly and crisply. Thank you.
Dennis.
Yeah, John had some good points there. I mean, this whole thing about killing the messenger and having some people who in the know, like I think most of us, we're seeing some patterns in the future that are just transformative, basically, of the human race, the planet, all this stuff. So we're the ones in the know, and we're pretty much in the role of messengers. Well, this goes back to biblical times. If you believe anything in the Bible, it's even you believe it as a historical document. You have the story of the Exodus, they're coming out of the desert, they find the promised land. A bunch of folks go in and explore, and they say, oh my God, they return with stories of giants. And the only people who were excited about the possibility were Joshua and Caleb, right? And they said, this is fantastic. Don't worry about the giants. We got it. And the giants, our current giants, are basically runaway capitalism and also the disaster that the planet has become due to runaway capitalism and greed, right? So they said, all right, we can take them. Let's go. Those are the only two. The rest of them says, are you crazy? And basically they all went back in the desert for 40 years. You know, that's how terrified they were of change and potential and possibilities of the near future. So I think we're in a situation like that. And maybe Joshua and Caleb weren't very good public speakers because they weren't able to win over the people. Moses wasn't even either in that example, right? We have other examples too that I think more positive. In Gandhi, I don't like to talk about Gandhi because I'm not Indian. I don't know the story that much, but I do know that he had a vision of, I call it emancipation of the people of India from British rule, from colonial.
You're on mute, Dennis.
Dennis, you went to mute.
Become authorities in the area of colonialism. No, what he did is social action. He went and said, hey, what is it that the people need right now? What is it they're struggling with that they can't do, that the British government is in their friggin' way? And he addressed them with that and says, all right, let me help them with their problem. And he created a social wave, I guess, of intent amongst those people saying, I can help you solve your problem. Let's do something about this. And because it's ruining your future as well. So he approached the people. And the corollary I have for you, Tanuja, is when you're on that plane, you're the Joshua and Caleb, you're the messenger going like, hey, I know what this is about. This is oppression. This is capitalism. This is a corporate, unfeeling, command and control bureaucracy, basically it's keeping us in our place as if we're just basically pieces of metal, right? Just part of the system of operations, right? So I don't know what your behavior was in there, but there were people who were saying like, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore. After half an hour, going like, hey, my existence is threatened. My health is threatened. And all these other people's are threatened. And they got up and did something about it. They said, hey, stewardesses, I don't care what your fucking protocol is. We're going to do something. We're going to open the doors ourselves, emergency hatches, if we need to. That's fine. I think that's where we need to be. You ask for a short-term solution of how to take care of situations that are evolving that were completely unpredictable but untenable, right? So how can we reach people like Gandhi did and say, train them in these practices? Gandhi was so keen on, you have to train and train and train in nonviolent practices. This is what he built his whole movement on. He says he knew violence would be hit with violence. You can't defeat, automatic weapons. I'm sorry, no, or nuclear bombs. You can't approach it that way. And he knew that people would get in trouble and get hurt if they did that. So he said, what other actions do we have? Well, what actions we have is we're consumers. We can be wise consumers. We also have a right to be treated a certain way. And we can teach others to only allow themselves to be treated a certain way and stand up for not only their own rights, but each other's rights, especially when we're in a situation like that. Then we can have a greater chance of getting what we want. And you talked about the market being too slow to respond. You can accelerate that response by demand, by strikes, by going on a general strike, by saying no to voting with your dollars, more like, I won't buy this. By basically essentially shaming the marketers, saying, hey, we won't buy your product and we're going to tell everyone not to buy your product until you change this thing. Like airlines will say, hey, we won't fly the airline if you're going to keep us in tin cans when it's hot and not run your air conditioner. We just won't buy, and we'll tell everyone not to buy. And also on the long term, entrepreneurial, John, like maybe there's an airline who gets it and says, hey, our feature is we're going to run air conditioners. We're going to pull a 240 volt line or whatever it takes to run air conditioners while we're on the tarmac waiting, if there's nothing they can do about the queue, right? So much we can do. And I think preparing people with those kind of responses, most people act like friggin' sheep. I can't believe it. Everywhere I go, I'm always that way. Guy who gets up and says, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. Let's do something about this, guys. Why are you just sitting there suffering? Right. Anyways, I'm done.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. Michael.
All right, to be followed by Michael.
Wow.
Yes, following on that energy wave, Michael.
Hello, welcome back Tanuja, but also all of us. Good to see everyone here.
Yeah.
I think for me, the perhaps most significant things to both celebrate. I heard you talking about self-assembly. Is a word that I would use to describe what you were inviting us to. That what Ostrom described as kind of units that self-assemble and do things that marketplaces and institutions don't do, is what I heard you in inviting more attention to, and how to build the capacity for pro-social self-assembly, given what there is witnessed in front. I don't want to fall into the debating society about it. It has a kind of quality of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin for me. And as someone who, whether it is the role of the marketplace, I was trained as an economist, and many of you know that I've had to unlearn many of the things that that I even hear people teaching and getting credentialed in today that we now know are false, but they're still being repeated as like the angels on the head of a pin. So without wanting to open that up too much, but to say that there's a different kind of change that was coming up for me. We recognize that tectonic plates was an inconceivable notion and resisted deeply by a whole range of expert practitioners until finally the idea broke through, right? That's the paradigm shift. There's something similar happening in climate change, that there's all these systems around CO2 monitoring, and there's a growing realization that it's the water cycle that has the biggest influence on whether or not bioregions are alive, they are fertile, whether it's just a whole different game than CO2 control. And so there's a whole conspiracy, you could say, but that's not the right word, vested stakeholders who have developed a series of capabilities, competence, and methodologies, just like the language of the marketplace, that all of a sudden are being made possibly not as relevant as they thought. And so they're simply ignoring it and not seeing it. And this is a dynamic that that is happening with how does self-assembly happen, and what are the capabilities that can be done through self-assembly that do not come from those other channels. And for there to be self-assembly, there does have to be a shared landscape, and it doesn't have to be everybody. It's whoever's self-assembling has to have a shared map, a shared view, a shared, sense. And then, and yeah, prediction is an inherent part of that. They have to have, and I know this was a controversial term. We kind of came up against it when I said we were addicted to prediction in the month that I was leading through a conversation, and I realized it was a useful conversation because I think it was Tanuja was like, well, I'm not sure we're addicted to prediction per se. That's an inherent architectural part of cognition. It's inescapable. But the question is, how are we related to what kinds of prediction, and how do we carry, for example, at the time we were talking about how the IMF makes predictions every year about the state of the marketplace, and they're 50% right and 50% wrong year after year after year. And yet we keep on turning back as kind of the group guess, so that at least we know how to co-orient as a group. That kind of collective sense making is something that's like, well, let's say we want to do this at the bioregional level, or we want to do it. How do we become more skillful at the map development and at the predicting? I think is a very powerful step in the direction of more effective localism. And there are some specific ideas that I'll follow up afterwards about. But yeah, and last comment that I'll make about the paradigm shift is that intelligence turns out may not be individually mediated. So it's like, are we willing to have this process transform us. We don't have to be, but science suggests that the more we are willing to be changed by these collective processes, the more accurately we'll be in alignment with reality. And yet our social models are that, no, I got to be my best. I've got to do me loudest. I've got to blah, blah, advocate for my point of view. And it's like, what happens if the rules of more skillful action are not being my best, but being my best? And it's a complete mind-blowing game. So thank you.
Thank
I
you,
agree.
Michael. That was
Yeah.
very helpful.
Also, what it brings to the table is relationality, not just in the narrow sense, but in every single sense there is. That relationality introduces a different dimension of functioning at every level. And we haven't even begun to incorporate that into anything at all. So I think I have an idea of why the word prediction has created this reaction, because for me, prediction is always just what I do, and then I wait to see how the system incorporates my thoughts or my thing. And I think that's because there's an underlying assumption in our current models of thinking, as well as education and everything else, of stasis, an assumption that things will work a certain way. So my ability to predict then is simply a skill set that I must develop, because the things will only work a certain way. See, there's no change in it.
Every school of economics.
Exactly. So anyway, Nikki, please.
Hi, everybody. So I really love this conversation and the dynamic nature of it in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, and I raised my hand like way back when, was to sort of like defend, maybe not even defend, but back up what I think Tanuja is trying to say about this in regards to the balance between logic and reason and spirituality. And she's 100% right in regards to how our brains are going to do certain things. Like some people see structural plans being too rigid and able to have catastrophic failures, but also as we increase the research we're doing on consciousness, we also need to acknowledge that things like intuition and foresight can be things that people are able to do. And I can tell you for sure, my intuition has saved me a lot. And that intuition gave me the ability to rationalize and predict the future outcomes I had in my path as a single mother that was really struggling to make sure that, from a certain point on, me, my son, and my sisters were not on the streets anymore, to figure out how to game a system that I didn't know how to game and survive in with the circumstances I had been given. But by following intuition, even in the most irrational ways, sometimes I had the most awesome outcomes that have had me brought here to all of you today. So maybe it's about flexibility. If we're talking about living systems, it's more about honoring individual capabilities and inputs, because that's also what happens in Indigenous ceremonies. Like, there's one time we were just looking for a missing dog, and everybody knew exactly who to have do what during the search for the dog. So, and trusted the intuition and predictions of where the dog would have gone and things of that nature. And it wasn't about, psychic abilities. It was just about a sense of relationship with that animal and a sense of familiarity with the circumstances and places and people, etc. So anyhow, that's my input for today.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Yes, holding everything lightly, not assuming the other person has a hard position, right? That's the common assumption, is that if someone says something, they're taking a hard stance. And I don't think that is, I really want to practice not automatically going there in my mind, and to allow that, oh, that's interesting. Let's think about that conceptually together. And that's what this group is so wonderful at doing, is really holding things lightly. And I appreciate that a great deal. Catherine.
I almost feel redundant here because some of the previous speakers have been so eloquent, Nikki and Michael in particular. You asked me at the beginning about autopoiesis, and then we got really stuck into thinking about prediction and how that goes. I would suggest that prediction may be a mechanical approach to life. And that there is something about being in the moment, which brings up for me Nikki's intuition, and the fact that it's all about relationship, because that's for me what intuition is. It's being sensitive to those relationships. Sometimes they're so sensitive that you can't really articulate them, but you feel them or you sense them. And that's for me what autopoiesis is about. It's this dance with everybody else. It's our ability to act, but in relationship and in response to and with all the other inputs that we have. So there's when you get beyond the body sense, there's a reflection piece that we really have not talked about at all, that needs to be part of the moving forward. I'm reminded of the indigenous thinking of 7 generations, but it's not in a predictive sense. It's in a relationship, responsive, caring sense, to sense into what would be the impact in the future, as opposed to predicting or deciding or manipulating or creating, which is a more mechanistic viewpoint. There's something about being very present in the moment and making sure that every action in the moment is correct, which means the future takes care of itself in a very rich way. And I think that's, especially when we talk about speed and major changes and large amounts of ambiguity, that's how we create the path forward. So prediction doesn't really exist in that space. But that doesn't mean that you don't reflect on consequences and implications, which is a different process. Anyway, my thoughts.
Thank you so much. And you guys, unfortunately, I've got to hop to a work deal. That is quite urgent. Next week, we're hoping to talk about right livelihood. So come on back for yet another exciting time. Thank you so much, everyone. Tanuja, over to you. I'm going to pop.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's been lovely to, I suppose, to kind of be back in a sense. I'm going to switch off the recording now. And thanks for the discussion, really, always.